In America's darkest court records, the most chilling crimes are not always committed by men. Hidden in plain sight are women black female killers whose actions tore through families, communities, and the nation's sense of safety. Each case in this list is real. Each name belongs to someone who chose violence with precision, cruelty, and finality. Case 1. Antoinette Renee Frank. Antoinette Renee Frank was once trusted to uphold the law. Born in 1971, she joined the New Orleans Police Department in the early 1990s, wearing the badge and uniform that symbolized authority behind that uniform. However, was a woman with mounting personal problems, financial instability, and a willingness to cross moral and legal lines. Colleagues would later recall her erratic behavior and questionable associations, including with a young man named Rogers Lacaze, whose criminal record was no secret. The crime that cemented her place in the annals of American criminal history unfolded on the night of March 4th, 1995 in New Orleans, Louisiana. Frank was on duty that night, but her true agenda had nothing to do with public safety. She and Lacaze targeted Kim An, a family-owned Vietnamese restaurant in the city's east area. Frank had been there before, as a customer and as an officer, building the illusion of trust with the owners. That trust would be shattered in minutes. Just after midnight, Frank used her police access to gain entry into the closed restaurant. Inside were off-duty NOPD officer Ronald Williams, who worked security for the restaurant, and members of the Vu family, armed with her service weapon. Frank moved with calculated steps. First, she directed her fire at Williams, a fellow officer, striking him fatally. She then turned her weapon on Ha Vu, the young daughter of the owners, and Quang Vu, her brother. The shots were clinical, delivered at close range. Witnesses who survived later described the precision and the lack of hesitation in her movements. The method was straightforward but shocking. This was not a frenzied killing. It was an execution carried out with the familiarity of someone trained in law enforcement tactics. Ballistics confirmed the rounds came from her department-issued firearm. The cash register was emptied, reinforcing robbery as part of the motive, though investigators later emphasized that the killings were equally about silencing witnesses. The motive, prosecutors argued, was a blend of financial desperation and personal recklessness. Frank was in deep debt, living beyond her means, and her association with Lacaze had pulled her into a criminal world that she could not or would not leave. Psychologists who reviewed the case described her actions as exhibiting instrumental aggression, violence not driven by rage, but by cold, calculated intent to achieve a goal. Her capture was almost immediate. Surviving members of the Vu family identified her without hesitation, naming the uniformed officer they had seen inside just before the shots rang out. Physical evidence, including her presence at the scene while on duty, placed her beyond reasonable doubt. Within hours, she was arrested by her own department. The legal proceedings moved quickly. In September 1995, Antoinette Frank was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. During the trial, her demeanor became a point of public outrage. Witnesses and journalists reported moments where she appeared detached, even casual, as if the gravity of the charges did not penetrate. The prosecution highlighted her betrayal not just of the victims, but of the public trust inherent in her badge. On Louisiana's death row, Frank remained one of the most infamous inmates in the state. Appeals were filed and denied over the years, but her sentence stood. Victims' families continued to speak out, insisting that justice be carried through to its conclusion. She became a rare example of a female police officer in the United States being condemned to death for a capital crime. The most chilling legacy of the case lies in the breach of trust. Frank had walked into the Kim An restaurant not as a masked intruder, but as a familiar, uniformed presence, someone the victims had no reason to fear until it was too late. The controlled nature of the killings, the choice of location, and the involvement of a sworn officer in a triple homicide left an enduring scar on the city of New Orleans and its police department. Today, Antoinette Frank remains on death row at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, her name synonymous with one of the darkest betrayals in the history of American law enforcement. The echoes of that night in March '95 still haunt survivors and serve as a reminder that sometimes the danger comes from those who wear the badge. Case 2, Kimberly LaGale McCarthy. Kimberly LaGale McCarthy was born in 1961 and, for many years, lived in the Dallas-Fort Worth area of Texas. She worked sporadically as an occupational therapist, but by the late 90s, her life had unraveled. She battled a severe crack cocaine addiction, was estranged from her husband, and faced mounting debts. Court records later painted the picture of a woman whose judgment and morality had been eroded by drug dependency and desperation for money. On July 21, '97, McCarthy targeted her neighbor, 71-year-old retired college professor Dorothy Booth. Booth was known in the Lancaster community as kind and charitable, a quality McCarthy would exploit. That afternoon, McCarthy visited Booth's home under the pretense of borrowing a cup of sugar. Once inside, she attacked with sudden violence. According to trial testimony, McCarthy first struck Booth with a candelabra, causing severe head trauma. She then stabbed the elderly woman multiple times with a butcher knife. In an act that shocked even seasoned investigators, McCarthy amputated Booth's left ring finger to steal her diamond wedding ring. The brutality of the assault was compounded by its purpose securing money and valuables to buy drugs. The physical evidence against McCarthy was overwhelming. Forensic teams recovered Booth's missing ring from a pawn shop, where McCarthy had sold it hours after the murder. Surveillance footage placed her near the scene, and DNA evidence tied her directly to the crime. Investigators also discovered Booth's credit cards in McCarthy's possession. The murder weapon, a blood-stained knife, was recovered from her home. What made the case even darker was the state's assertion that Booth was not McCarthy's only victim. Prosecutors presented evidence linking her to the earlier killings of two elderly women in 1988 and 1989, both unsolved at the time. While she was never convicted for those murders, their similarities of vulnerable victim, theft of jewelry, and lethal blunt force trauma strengthened the argument for her dangerousness. McCarthy's arrest came quickly. The day after the murder, Lancaster police served a search warrant on her residence. Inside, they found incriminating items, drug paraphernalia, and clothing stained with Booth's blood. Confronted with the evidence, McCarthy initially denied involvement, later shifting to claims of a drug-fueled blackout. The jury found these explanations unconvincing. In '98, she was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the verdict, but procedural issues led to her conviction being overturned in 2002. A retrial in 2003 resulted in another conviction and the same death sentence. Over the next decade, McCarthy filed multiple appeals, citing ineffective counsel and alleging racial bias in jury selection. Those appeals failed at both state and federal levels. During her years on Texas's death row, McCarthy's demeanor alternated between calm resignation and outspoken criticism of the justice system. In media interviews, she maintained that she had been unfairly prosecuted, though she stopped short of a full confession. Victims' advocates, meanwhile, emphasized the brutality of Booth's death and the vulnerability of elderly victims targeted for profit. On June 26, 2013, McCarthy was executed by lethal injection at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville. She was 52 years old. In her final statement, she addressed her friends and supporters, expressing love but offering no direct apology to the victim's family. Witnesses described her as composed in her final moments, speaking steadily before the injection took effect. The McCarthy case stands out for its stark convergence of addiction, opportunism, and calculated violence. It is a reminder that some of the most lethal offenders are those who blend into the fabric of a community until a single act rips that facade away. For law enforcement, it reinforced the importance of forensic evidence in securing a conviction and the dangers faced by vulnerable populations. Case 3. Tiffany Nicole Moss. Tiffany Nicole Moss was not a stranger to her victim. Born in the early 1980s, she lived in Gwinnett County, Georgia, and married a man Moss in 2009. With that marriage came responsibility for his daughter from a previous relationship. 10-year-old Imani Gabrielle Moss. To neighbors, Tiffany appeared quiet and reserved, behind closed doors. However, prosecutors would later say she became a calculated abuser. hiding years of mistreatment until it ended in a slow, deliberate killing. The crime began to take shape in 2013. Over the course of months, Tiffany and her husband subjected Imani to systematic starvation. School officials and child protection workers had previously investigated the family after signs of neglect, but Tiffany deflected questions. Avoiding direct intervention, by October of that year, Imani weighed barely 32 pounds, less than half the healthy weight for her age. Medical experts would testify that she was in an advanced state of malnutrition, her body breaking down as it consumed itself. On October 28, 2013, the abuse reached its fatal end inside the family's apartment in Lawrenceville, Georgia. Tiffany and Emin did not seek medical help as Imani lay dying. Instead, they allowed her to succumb to starvation after her death. The couple attempted to conceal the crime. Iman placed his daughter's body in a metal trash can, poured gasoline over it, and set it on fire in a wooded area. A neighbor called police after seeing smoke and smelling burning fuel. When officers responded, they quickly traced the scene back to the Moss residence. Iman was taken into custody first, and under questioning. He implicated Tiffany as the driving force behind the abuse, according to his statements. She controlled Imani's food intake, confined her to her bedroom, and withheld basic care. The arrest of Tiffany Moss came within hours. At trial, prosecutors presented medical evidence, testimony from teachers, and text messages between Tiffany and Iman discussing the child's condition. The state's theory was clear. Tiffany's motive was to remove Imani from her life without the complications of a custody battle. Forensic psychologists described her behavior as predatory neglect, a sustained pattern of withholding resources necessary for survival, motivated by a desire to assert control and eliminate a perceived burden. One unusual aspect of the case was Tiffany's decision to represent herself in court during her 2019 trial. She declined legal counsel, addressed the jury directly, and offered no substantial defense. She did not cross-examine witnesses in depth and presented no mitigating evidence during the penalty phase. Legal analysts called it a death wish defense strategy, noting that it virtually guaranteed a capital verdict. On April 29, 2019, the jury convicted Tiffany Moss of malice murder, felony murder, and child cruelty. She was sentenced to death, making her one of the very few women and the only woman on Georgia's death row at the time. The judge, in issuing the sentence, described her actions as inhumane, calculated, and beyond comprehension. The most chilling moments in the courtroom came not from outbursts or emotional displays, but from the absence of them. Observers noted that Tiffany showed no visible reaction when the guilty verdict was read. She remained seated, expressionless. As the judge pronounced the death sentence, that composure, in the face of overwhelming evidence and the loss of her own freedom, left a lasting impression on jurors and the public. Today, Tiffany Moss remains housed at the Arundel State Prison, under the strict conditions reserved for death row inmates. Appeals are pending, but the evidence against her documented abuse, forensic proof, and her own trial strategy makes reversal unlikely. The case stands as a rare instance of a female death sentence in Georgia, and a grim reminder of how cruelty can manifest not in sudden violence, but in the quiet, methodical deprivation of life over time. Case 4. Mitchell Blair. Mitchell Blair was a mother of 4 living in Detroit, Michigan, to neighbors in the Martin Luther King apartments. She appeared private, sometimes withdrawn, but nothing suggested the level of violence hidden inside her home. Born in the early 1980s, Blair had a history of volatile relationships and frequent disputes with neighbors and family members. Beneath the surface, she harbored deep suspicions about her own children, suspicions that she claimed justified acts that would shock the city. The crimes came to light on March 24, 2015, when a court officer arrived at Blair's apartment to carry out an eviction. Inside, officers found an old, unplugged freezer. When they opened it, they discovered the frozen remains of 2 children, 9-year-old Stephen Gage Berry and 13-year-old Stoney Ann Blair. The bodies had been there for years, Stephen since 2012, Stoney since 2013. According to Blair's own statements in court, she killed Stephen first. She claimed he had sexually abused a younger sibling. Blair described beating him repeatedly, pouring hot water on him, and eventually suffocating him with a plastic bag. A year later, she accused Stoney of the same abuse, She subjected the girl to the same cycle of beatings, scalding, and deprivation before ultimately killing her in the same manner. Investigators noted that no evidence outside of Blair's statements confirmed the sexual abuse allegations, and authorities stressed that the claims were never substantiated. The method was deliberate and drawn out. Both victims suffered prolonged physical assaults over days or weeks before death. Blair showed no hesitation in admitting to the killings once confronted. In fact, during her court appearances, she spoke openly, even defiantly, about what she had done. She told the judge she would do it again if faced with the same circumstances, insisting that her actions were a form of justice. The motive, as Blair described it, was vigilante retribution. Forensic psychologists later labeled her mindset as moral disengagement, a cognitive process where an individual reframes their actions as righteous. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence of cruelty, Blair's lack of remorse and her justification of the killings became central to the public's horror. She was arrested immediately after the discovery. Detroit police secured the apartment and recovered additional evidence of prolonged abuse, including belts, electrical cords, and other items consistent with the injuries described in autopsy reports. The two surviving children were taken into protective custody. In June 2015, Blair pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of child abuse. She waived her right to a jury trial, sparing the surviving children from testifying. During the plea hearing, her statements were chilling. In their clarity, she described each killing in detail, never wavering or softening her language. The court sentenced Blair to mandatory life in prison without the possibility of parole. She is currently serving her sentence at the Huron Valley Correctional Facility for Women in Michigan. There are no avenues for release. Her case remains one of the most disturbing examples of intrafamilial homicide in Michigan's modern history. The Blair case left a permanent scar on the community. It raised questions about the limits of child protective services. As prior welfare checks had not uncovered the abuse, it also became a reference point in discussions of hidden domestic homicides, killings that occur within the family unit, concealed from public view until a chance discovery exposes the truth. To this day, the image of 2 children's bodies sealed in a freezer remains one of the most haunting crime scene discoveries in Detroit. Blair's unflinching courtroom admissions and her assertion that she acted as her own judge, jury, and executioner ensure that her name remains synonymous with cold-blooded, premeditated violence carried out in the place that should have been safest, her own home. Case 5. Kimia Hassel. Kimia Hassel was a 22-year-old Army specialist stationed in Michigan, married to Sergeant Tyrone Hassel III, a decorated soldier with a promising military career, to friends and family. They appeared to be a young, ambitious couple, both serving in the armed forces, both with futures shaped by discipline and service, beneath the surface. However, Kimia was leading a double life, entangled in an affair with another soldier, Specialist Jeremy Queller. That relationship, fueled by desire and the prospect of financial gain, would end in a calculated act of murder. On the night of December 31st, 2018, Berrien County, Michigan, was quiet under winter skies. Tyrone was home from a holiday gathering, preparing to return to base. Kimia had orchestrated his murder with meticulous planning. She and Queller had spent weeks exchanging messages, discussing how to end Tyrone's life without drawing suspicion. The plan hinged on timing and location. At approximately 11 p.m., as Tyrone stepped out of his car in the driveway of his parents' home in St. Joseph Township, Queller was waiting, armed with a 9mm handgun. He ambushed Tyrone, firing multiple shots. The attack was sudden, leaving Tyrone no chance to defend himself. Neighbors reported hearing gunfire followed by the sound of a car speeding away. The method was textbook assassination, an ambush designed for maximum surprise and minimal exposure. Investigators later described it as military precision applied to a domestic crime. Tyrone's injuries were fatal before emergency services could arrive. Suspicion turned quickly to Kimia. Interviews with friends and family revealed tension in the marriage and rumors of infidelity. Detectives obtained search warrants for her phone and social media accounts. What they found removed any doubt: hundreds of messages between Kimia and Queller, detailing the plot. They discussed life insurance payouts, the division of benefits, and life together after Tyrone's death. The motive was a blend of financial greed and the removal of an obstacle to her relationship with Cuellar. Both were arrested within days. Kimia maintained a facade of shock and grief in early police interviews, but confronted with the digital evidence, she could offer no credible explanation. Prosecutors charged her with first-degree premeditated murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Her trial in August 20 laid bare the cold, methodical planning behind the crime. Jurors heard the recorded jail calls, read text message transcripts, and saw the calculated steps taken to lure Tyrone into a vulnerable position. The prosecution emphasized that this was not a crime of passion, but of strategy carefully scheduled to occur on a night when Tyrone's guard was down. The verdict was unanimous. Kimia Hassel was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In her final statement before sentencing, she offered no direct apology to Tyrone's family. Observers noted her subdued demeanor, but also her lack of visible remorse. Cuellar, tried separately, received the same sentence. The most shocking element of the case was the contrast between the disciplined, service-oriented image of a soldier and the betrayal that occurred within that circle. The use of military training and tactics in a civilian murder underscored the premeditation and lethal efficiency of the act. For the military community, the crime was a violation of trust for Tyrone's family. It was an irreparable loss made worse by the fact that it came from inside their own home. Today, Kimia Hassel is serving her sentence at the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Michigan. She will never be eligible for release. Her case stands as a reminder that betrayal can take root even in institutions built on loyalty and service, and that calculated violence can emerge in the most disciplined of environments. Case 6. Carla Ray Hughes. Carla Ray Hughes was, by outward appearances, a poised and educated young woman. Born in 1976, she worked as a school teacher in Jackson, Mississippi. In 2006, she was engaged to be married and appeared to be building a stable life. Beneath that veneer, however, was a volatile mix of jealousy, obsession, and willingness to remove any obstacle by any means necessary. That obstacle was Avis Banks, a 27-year-old pregnant woman who was engaged to Hughes' lover, Keon Pittman. On the evening of November 29, 2006, the quiet suburb of Ridgeland, Mississippi, was shattered by a call to police reporting a shooting. Inside the garage of her home, Avis Banks was found lying in a pool of blood. She had been shot 4 times, including twice in the head, and stabbed multiple times in the chest. The violence was personal, deliberate, and unrelenting. Her unborn child did not survive. The investigation quickly revealed no signs of forced entry. Detectives learned that Keon Pittman, a local basketball coach, was romantically involved with Hughes, and the relationship had been ongoing for months. Cell phone records and witness statements placed Hughes in the vicinity of the crime scene shortly before the murder. The method of the attack reflected planning and familiarity with the victim's routine. Prosecutors argued that Hughes had driven to Banks's home while Pittman was away at basketball practice. She lay in wait, ambushing Banks as she arrived home from work. The combination of gunfire and stabbing suggested an intent not only to kill, but to ensure death beyond any doubt. Forensic analysis confirmed that the bullets were fired from a .38 caliber revolver linked to Hughes, and the knife wounds were consistent with a blade recovered from her possession. Motive was clear. Hughes saw Banks as the barrier to a life with Pittman. Testimony during trial revealed that Hughes had told friends she wanted Banks out of the picture. The prosecution labeled it a textbook example of elimination, removing a rival to secure a desired relationship. Hughes' arrest came within days of the murder. A search of her vehicle uncovered ammunition matching the murder weapon, along with other incriminating evidence. She denied involvement, claiming she was elsewhere at the time, but surveillance footage and cell tower data dismantled her alibi. Her trial began in February 2009. Over the course of 2 weeks, the state presented a timeline pieced together from phone records, traffic cameras, and eyewitness accounts. Forensic experts testified about ballistic matches, blood spatter analysis, and the proximity of shots fired. The defense attempted to raise doubts about the reliability of the forensic evidence, but the jury was unmoved. On March 6, 2009, Carla Hughes was convicted of 2 counts of capital murder, one for Avis Banks and one for her unborn child. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge described the crime as cold-blooded, calculated, and motivated by selfish desire. Observers noted that Hughes maintained a composed demeanor throughout the proceedings, rarely showing visible emotion, even at sentencing. She stood still, eyes forward. As the judge read the verdict, there was no apology to the victim's family, no acknowledgement of responsibility. Today, Hughes is serving her sentence at the Central Mississippi Correctional Facility, with no parole eligibility. She will spend the rest of her life behind bars. The case remains a grim example of how personal relationships can turn lethal when jealousy and entitlement combine with access to deadly means. For the community of Ridgeland, the killing of Avis Banks was not only a tragic loss of a young woman and her child, but also a reminder that danger can come from those hiding in plain sight, those who smile in public while plotting in private. Hughes' case is often cited in criminal justice discussions as an example of premeditated domestic homicide driven by romantic obsession, where the calculated removal of a rival becomes the central motive for murder. Case 7, Shanika Minor. Shanika Minor's path to becoming one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives began with a petty dispute that escalated into calculated homicide. Born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in the early 1990s, Minor had a history of confrontational behavior and brushes with the law, but nothing that foreshadowed the notoriety she would achieve in 2016. Her crime would combine impulsive aggression with deliberate follow-through, leaving 2 lives lost, one of them unborn. On March 6, 2016, the scene was a 2-story duplex on Milwaukee's northwest side. Minor's mother lived downstairs. Upstairs was 23-year-old Tameka Perry, 9 months pregnant. According to investigators, the conflict between Minor and Perry began days earlier over loud music. Minor believed Perry had disrespected her mother, and that perceived slight festered into something more. Late on the night of March 5th, Minor confronted Perry at her apartment door. Armed with a handgun, she argued with her about the noise. Perry closed the door. Attempting to end the confrontation, witnesses reported Minor pacing outside, muttering about how Perry had no respect, instead of leaving. She returned in the early hours of March 6th, approaching the door again while Perry stood just inside with her mother. Minor raised the pistol and fired through the doorway. Striking Perry in the chest, Perry collapsed. And her unborn child, a week from delivery, died moments later. The shooting was precise and sudden, leaving no chance for medical intervention. Forensic evidence showed the shot was fired from close range, aimed directly at vital organs. Authorities classified the killing as a double homicide under Wisconsin law because the unborn child was viable after the shooting. Minor fled the scene. She avoided immediate arrest by moving between acquaintances' homes and crossing state lines. The Milwaukee Police Department, working with the U.S. Marshals Service, tracked her movements but missed her by hours on several occasions. In June 2016, the FBI placed her on its 10 most wanted list, citing her as armed and dangerous. The listing described her as volatile and likely to engage in further violence if cornered. The manhunt ended on July 1, 2016, when agents received a tip that Minor was hiding at a motel in Fayetteville, North Carolina. She was arrested without incident, reportedly showing little emotion as she was led away in handcuffs. Charged with first-degree intentional homicide and first-degree intentional homicide of an unborn child, Minor faced trial in Milwaukee County Circuit Court. Prosecutors framed the crime as an escalation of a trivial argument into lethal violence, noting that Minor had multiple opportunities to walk away. Defense counsel could offer little mitigation, given the eyewitness accounts, ballistic evidence, and Minor's flight from justice. In January 2017, Minor pleaded guilty to both counts. The court sentenced her to 30 years in prison, followed by extended supervision. The judge, in pronouncing the sentence, emphasized the needless loss of life and the reckless disregard for the unborn child's imminent birth. The most jarring element of the case was the disproportionality between cause and consequence. What began as a neighborly dispute over noise ended with 2 deaths, a multi-state manhunt, and a place on one of law enforcement's most exclusive fugitive lists for criminal psychologists. Minor's case illustrated a dangerous blend of impulsivity and willingness to eliminate perceived disrespect through deadly force. Today, Shanika Minor is serving her sentence at the Taycheedah Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. She will be in her mid-50s when eligible for release, assuming no further disciplinary or legal issues. The Perry family remains vocal about the lasting trauma, particularly the loss of a child who never had the chance to be born. The case stands as a stark reminder of how quickly personal conflicts can spiral when fueled by resentment, access to firearms, and a mindset that views lethal violence as a legitimate resolution to minor disputes. Case 8, Crystal Mangum, Crystal Guile. Mangum was no stranger to public controversy. Born in 1978 in Durham, North Carolina, she first entered national headlines in 2006 as the accuser in the high-profile and ultimately discredited Duke lacrosse case. Though that case ended without convictions and her credibility was publicly dismantled, Mangum continued to live in Durham under the shadow of notoriety. Years later, her name would resurface not in the realm of allegations, but in connection to a fatal act of violence. By 2011, Mangum's personal life was marked by instability. She had a documented history of volatile relationships, domestic disputes, and arrests for assault and property damage. She was living with her boyfriend, 46-year-old Reginald Day, in a Durham apartment complex. Friends and neighbors described their relationship as stormy, with frequent arguments and accusations from both sides. On the night of April 3, 2011, police received a call from Day's apartment. Officers arrived to find Day bleeding heavily from a single stab wound to the torso. Mangum was present, appearing distressed, but offering an explanation that investigators would quickly challenge. She claimed she had stabbed Day in self-defense after he attacked her during an argument. Day was rushed to Duke University Hospital, where surgeons attempted to repair the damage. Initially, he survived the surgery, but 10 days later, on April 13th, he died from complications related to the stab wound. The location and nature of the wound told a different story than Mangum's self-defense claim. Forensic analysis determined that the knife entered in a manner consistent with a forward, intentional thrust aimed at a vital area. There were no defensive wounds on Mangum, and no signs of an imminent threat to her life that could legally justify the stabbing under North Carolina's self-defense statutes. Investigators also uncovered a troubling context. Mangum had a prior history of assaultive behavior, including a 2010 incident in which she was charged with attempted murder after allegedly setting a boyfriend's clothes on fire in a bathtub while he was inside the home. That case was eventually reduced to misdemeanor charges, but it established a pattern of escalating violence in domestic situations. Following Day's death, the charge against Mangum was upgraded from assault with a deadly weapon to second-degree murder. Prosecutors argued that the stabbing was the culmination of a heated argument, driven by anger rather than any immediate threat to her safety. They also noted her decision to remain at the scene rather than flee or seek help immediately for Day, a factor they presented as evidence of intent rather than accident. The trial began in November 2013 at the Durham County Courthouse. Over the course of a week, jurors heard testimony from responding officers, forensic pathologists, and medical experts. The prosecution emphasized the fatal trajectory of the wound and the lack of credible evidence supporting her self-defense claim. The defense attempted to cast doubt on the cause of death, suggesting that medical complications, not the initial wound, were ultimately responsible. But expert testimony linked those complications directly to the stabbing. On November 20, 2013, the jury found Crystal Mangum guilty of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to a term of 14 to 18 years in the North Carolina Department of Correction. At sentencing, she addressed the court, expressing sorrow for Day's death, but continuing to assert that she had acted to protect herself. The victim's family rejected her claims, calling the killing senseless and preventable. Mangum's case was significant not just for the crime itself, but for the way her earlier notoriety influenced public perception. While the court barred references to the Duke lacrosse case during the trial, the media inevitably drew connections. For many in the public, the 2011 stabbing confirmed an image of Mangum as a figure drawn repeatedly into violence and legal trouble. Today, Crystal Mangum remains incarcerated in North Carolina, serving her sentence with a projected release date in the late 20s. Appeals have been filed, but have not succeeded in overturning her conviction. Her name continues to provoke debate. Some view her as a deeply troubled individual, prone to destructive relationships. Others as a person whose earlier media infamy overshadowed any chance of a fair assessment of her later actions. The killing of Reginald Day stands as the defining criminal act of her life, eclipsing even the sensationalism of her earlier public controversies. It is a reminder that notoriety, whether earned or unjustly given, does not shield a person from the consequences of deliberate violence, and that patterns of escalating aggression in domestic settings can end with lethal results. Case 9. Jasmia and Tasmia Whitehead. Jasmia and Tasmia Whitehead were identical twins, born in 1993 and raised in Conyers, Georgia. Two outsiders. The sisters appeared inseparable, sharing the same classes, friends, and routines, but within their home, the relationship with their mother, Jarmeka Nikki Whitehead, was strained, volatile, and often explosive. Neighbors and relatives knew of frequent arguments, but no one imagined it would end in one of Georgia's most disturbing domestic homicides. On the morning of January 13, 2010, police were called to the Whitehead home in a quiet Conyers subdivision. Inside, they found Nikki Whitehead dead in the bathroom. She had been stabbed multiple times and suffered severe blunt force trauma. The scene suggested a violent struggle, blood spattered on the walls, overturned items, and signs of a prolonged confrontation. Initially, investigators considered the possibility of an intruder, but inconsistencies in the twins' statements quickly raised suspicion. They claimed they had discovered the body after returning from school, yet their timelines didn't align, and there was no sign of forced entry. Detectives also noted the absence of defensive injuries on the girls, strange for daughters claiming to have stumbled upon such a gruesome scene. Over the next year, the investigation methodically dismantled their alibi. Cell phone records placed the twins at the house during the likely time of death. Blood evidence matched Nikki's DNA on their clothing. Forensic analysis indicated that at least 2 people had inflicted the injuries. Consistent with the theory that both sisters participated in the attack, the method of the killing was brutal. Prosecutors later detailed how the confrontation began as a heated argument over household rules and discipline. The fight escalated, and the twins armed themselves with a kitchen knife and a heavy vase. The assault combined stabbing and bludgeoning, delivering fatal wounds to their mother. Medical examiners reported more than 80 injuries, indicating sustained violence rather than a single moment of rage. The motive was rooted in years of tension. The twins had been living with their great-grandmother due to conflicts with Nikki, but had recently returned to their mother's home under court order, according to testimony. They resented her rules and felt trapped by the arrangement. Prosecutors characterized the killing as a premeditated act, born out of anger and resentment. While defense attorneys argued it was an eruption of uncontrolled emotion, the sisters were not immediately charged. For 2 years, the case remained under investigation as authorities gathered evidence strong enough to counter any claims of self-defense. In 2012, both were arrested and charged with malice murder, felony murder, and aggravated assault. Facing overwhelming evidence, the twins ultimately entered plea deals. In 2014, Jasmia and Tasmia each pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter, receiving 30-year prison sentences. At their plea hearings, both gave brief statements acknowledging responsibility. Observers noted their subdued demeanor far removed from the defiance they had displayed in early police interviews. The case drew national attention because of the perpetrator's age and their familial relationship to the victim. True crime analysts often highlight the rarity of matricide committed jointly by siblings, particularly twins. Psychologists reviewing the case pointed to a shared psychosis dynamic, where the twins reinforced each other's hostility toward their mother, escalating conflict into lethal violence. Today, the sisters are serving their sentences in separate Georgia state prisons. They will be in their mid-40s when eligible for release, assuming no disciplinary issues. Nikki Whitehead's family continues to speak publicly about the tragedy, emphasizing the warning signs of deep familial conflict and the need for intervention before it turns deadly. The murder of Nikki Whitehead stands as a chilling reminder that danger can emerge from within the closest relationships. In this case, the perpetrators were not strangers, intruders, or distant acquaintances. They were her own children, acting together in an act of betrayal and violence that forever destroyed a family. Case 10, Shanna Decree, Pennsylvania. Shanna Decree lived in a modest apartment in Morrisville, Bucks County, Pennsylvania, with her daughter, Dominique, to neighbors. They seemed quiet, sometimes withdrawn, but not unusual for the small community, behind closed doors. However, their lives had taken a dark turn. By early 2019, Shanna had become convinced that her family was in mortal danger from what she described as evil forces. This delusional belief would lead to one of the most unsettling family mass murders in the state's history. On February 25, 2018, police conducted a welfare check at the Decree apartment after relatives reported not hearing from the family for days. Inside, officers found a scene that was both chaotic and eerily calm. 5 bodies lay across the living room and bedrooms Shanna's 2 other children, Naira Smith, 25, and Damon Decree Jr., 13, her sister, Jamila Campbell, 42, and Campbell's twin daughters, Imani and Erica Allen, 9. All had died from asphyxiation, either strangulation or smothering. The apartment showed no signs of forced entry. It was clear the victims had not been attacked by outsiders. Shanna and Dominique were found alive but disoriented. In initial interviews, their accounts were fragmented, laced with references to religious cleansing, demonic possession, and a belief that killing their relatives would set them free. Investigators concluded that Shanna and Dominique had acted together in what prosecutors would later describe as a cult-like murder pact. The method was intimate and deliberate. The victims were either manually strangled or suffocated with a soft object. There were no defensive wounds suggesting a struggle with an outside attacker, but evidence indicated some victims resisted. The lack of external injuries on Shanna and Dominique supported the theory that the killings were carried out in a controlled, overpowering manner, likely with both women restraining and smothering each victim in turn. Motive, in the legal sense, was tied to Shanna's mental state. Psychiatrists who later examined her diagnosed severe mental illness with psychotic features, but prosecutors emphasized that she understood the nature of her actions. In recorded police interviews, Shanna described the killings in a detached tone, stating that she believed she was saving her family from a worse fate. Dominique echoed similar language, suggesting a shared delusional belief. Both women were arrested at the scene and charged with 5 counts of criminal homicide. The case moved quickly through the Bucks County Court of Common Pleas, given the overwhelming evidence and the defendants' confessions. The primary legal question became whether they would face the death penalty. In June 21, Shanna and Dominique entered negotiated pleas of guilty but mentally ill. This plea spared them from capital punishment while ensuring they would serve 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole at sentencing. Family members of the victims spoke about the immeasurable loss and the enduring shock that such violence came from within their own bloodline. Observers noted that Shanna's demeanor in court alternated between calm resignation and brief flashes of emotion when certain family members were mentioned. Dominique appeared subdued, speaking only when addressed by the judge. Neither offered a direct apology for the killings, instead reiterating their belief that their actions were necessary at the time. The most haunting element of the case is its complete inversion of the family's purpose. Home, traditionally a place of safety, became the setting for calculated, intimate killings, carried out by a mother and daughter against those they were expected to protect. The lack of an external trigger, no financial gain, no outside assailant, makes the case stand apart as a crime driven entirely by distorted belief and shared psychological collapse. Today, Shanna Decree is incarcerated at SCI Muncie, a Pennsylvania state prison for women, serving her life sentences. Dominique is housed in the same facility under similar terms. Their case remains a reference point in criminal law discussions about shared psychotic disorder, also known as folie à deux, and the balance between mental illness considerations and accountability in multiple victim homicides. You've just uncovered 10 of the most chilling cases of Black female killers in the United States: Antoinette Frank, Kimberly McCarthy, Tiffany Moss, Mitchell Blair, Kimia Hassel, Carla Ray Hughes, Shanika Minor, Crystal Mangum, Jasmia and Tasmia Whitehead, and Shanna Decree, women who should have been protectors, partners, or family turning into predators. Which of these names chills you the most? Let us know in the comments. For more true crime stories like this, remember to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Evil doesn't always look like a stranger. It can live behind the face you trust the most.